So welcome everyone. So really the goal of our time together today is to walk you through the changes and updates that we made to our online competency model. So Chloe and I are going to take a few moments to introduce ourselves and orient you as to the purpose of our time here together, as well as some of the functionalities that we'll be using to create some interaction in the webinar. And so my name is Patricia Barata. I have a PhD in organizational psychology. I've been with our firm Humance for over 2 years now as part of our talent assessment and onboarding practice. And really the focus of my role is to elevate leaders' awareness of their strengths and areas for development and coaching them to achieve their professional aspirations and growth.
Hi everyone, my name is Chloe and I'm a consultant in the leadership and team development practice at Humance. I have my Master's of Science in Organizational Psychology, and I've been at Humance for about 2.5 years now, where I work mostly in workshop design and facilitation, assessment, as well as our virtual development paths.
Okay, so before we get started, let's talk about some of the functionalities that are available as part of our Zoom webinar. So there are a few ways in which we will encourage interaction. So first is the chat. So if you have any comments or reactions that you'd like to share with other attendees in the webinar, feel free to use the chat to communicate with one another. If you have any questions for us as we're going through the content, if you need clarity or you'd like to probe more deeply into something, then use the Q&A function. So Chloe and I will be looking throughout the questions at the end of the webinar and then taking some time at the end of the webinar to address the questions that you have that are related to content. And the third way that we'll encourage interaction is through the polling feature. So there might be a few times during the webinar where we ask you a question where we're curious to hear your reactions or your perspectives. Okay.
Great. So today what we'll be discussing first is our rationale for the optimizations and really what motivated us to make these optimizations to our various tools. So we'll explain to you where the ideas came from and what we aimed to meet with your needs. So we'll also outline the content optimizations and how you can use these optimizations in your work. So as Patricia mentioned, we'll be conducting a poll here to really just gauge the group's experience and reactions to these optimizations. And then we'll be ending by summarizing some best practices regarding the use of our tools, and then we'll open it up to questions and comments.
Okay, so just to talk a little bit about our vision for why we introduced some of these updates and changes. And so really within the talent assessment and onboarding team at Humance, our vision is really not just to assess people, but really to get to know them and really help them to move forward and grow within their roles in a way that really aligns with their aspirations. And so we really have grounded those updates within that vision of really getting to know people and supporting them in their professional careers. And so if we look at some of the improvements that we've made, this slide really summarizes some of our motivations to make some of these updates and optimizations. And so in conversations with our clients as well as our candidates, we heard that some of the language with our competency model wasn't necessarily resonating with them or adapted to their reality. And so we integrated that feedback and we adapted the language in our competency model to really align with our clients and candidates' reality. We also wanted to make sure that we're always providing up-to-date tools for our clients, and so we updated our competency model and online referential based on recent evidence. And as well, we wanted to make sure that we provided a fuller range of tools, so a fuller range of tools available to you to support you in your onboarding initiatives as well as the development of your employees. Okay.
Great. So what is the added value for your organization? Well, first of all, we wanted to offer you specific tools adapted to the current context. So despite the pandemic, the labor shortage remains very present and retention is always difficult. So therefore, we've made several additions to the development avenues so that you'll have several tools to really propel your workforce even further. These additions will also help you provide tools to candidates with whom you see a lot of potential, but maybe who are not really where you want them to be just yet. So, plus our interview questions now include situational questions that will help you realize the potential of candidates who have less experience in their field. Secondly, we're concerned that each of your processes share a common language, as Patricia was mentioning. So in other words, you can really leverage the competency model repository, create development plans, and offer easily accessible resources to your employees, all under one common language and really using a strengths-based approach. So you'll see that in our development paths, we put even more importance on the strengths of employees and how you can really leverage the strengths and move those forward. And finally, we also reviewed our talent repository, which will be made available online soon, so stay tuned for that. And here we're really taking an approach that's focused on the next steps. So for instance, diving deeper into the next steps required to further highlight the strengths of the person being assessed.
Okay, so let's talk about the first type of optimization we made to our online referential. And so I'm sure many of you who have used the online referential have used the competency model framework there. And so we made some changes to that. And most of these are small changes, but really the goal is to make sure that we have, more precise labeling and definitions of those competencies. And so the content optimizations that we made in our competency model fall into 3 categories. So first, for some, we changed the label or the name that we give to that competency. And that really provides more precision as to what we mean when we talk about that competency. Second, we changed or made some changes to some of the definitions of those competencies to really, again, get more precision and to really capture what we mean by that specific competency. And then third, we made some changes to the behavioral anchors to really provide more nuanced, targeted behaviors that really capture what we're looking for, what we're evaluating with that competency. And so really in our webinar, our goal is not to review every change that we made, but give you some very concrete, rich examples to help you understand, the reasons for those changes and the impact that those changes will have. And then following the webinar, we'll give you some appendices that really detail those changes specifically. Okay, so here we'll see that there were 9 competencies where we made some changes to. And so in the next slides, I'll run through some specific examples of 3 specific competencies that really give you insight into the types of changes that we made. So if we go to the next slide, we'll see that this is an example of a competency where the only change that we made was a change in the name. So before we had judgment, and now we've labeled it decision-making quality. And so, the motivation behind this specific change was around the language that we were using in terms of if that language really resonates. And we found in conversations with clients that they weren't really comfortable using, the label of judgment with their candidates, especially if that individual scored low, because it's, more derogatory or pejorative to say someone has lower judgment versus decision-making quality. And decision-making quality really, more so captures what we mean when we say judgment. Really what we mean with this competency is, the rigor and the thoughtfulness that's really applied with respect to decision-making. So the concept itself is still the same, but we have a more accurate label. So the second type of change that we made is a change in facets of the definition. So this is an instance where we've changed the definition to more accurately reflect our client's reality. And so I'll give you an example with courage to act. And so when we have clients that are interested in this competency, it's typically because they're looking for managers who have the courage to have tough conversations with their employees, to give difficult feedback, or potentially, really intervene in challenging situations. And so we modified the definition for courage to act to capture that notion of intervention, as well as you'll see with facet C, we've added being able to give that tough feedback. So we're capturing, what our clients really care about in their reality. And the third type of change that we made is changes to the behavioral anchors. And so here is an example with developing strategy. The label is still the same, the definition still captures or is the same, but we've made some small tweaks to the behavioral anchors, in this case for facet A, to capture a nuance that wasn't previously included in the behavioral anchor. So we included the notion of risk. So when developing strategy, being able to mitigate risk. And so it's a small change or a small nuance, but the impact that it has and the benefit is that it gives you more precision in terms of, what behaviors you're looking for in candidates or what behaviors you'd like to develop within your leadership team. So at this point, we would welcome if you have, comments or reactions, to feel free to share that in the chat. And maybe think about, I would be curious to know, are there any reactions about how you anticipate, some of these changes or these types of changes might have within your organization? And so we'll just give you a minute if you have anything that you want to share, take the time to respond. And if not, then we'll move on to the next slide, but I want to make sure that everyone has a chance to respond if they'd like to. And I'll speak more broadly to it as well. So some of the impact of these changes, at least of what we've heard for our clients, is that we're using, one of the key advantages of a competency model is creating that common language within your organization. And so we're really following that same principle by using language within the competency labels and definitions so that language continues to resonate. And that more precision and nuance that we included so that you have a more focused understanding or targeted understanding of, the behaviors that you'd like to develop or that you're looking for in candidates. Okay, let's move on to the next optimization.
So regarding the optimization of the interview questions, we've made 3 main optimizations. So first of all, we've added remarks for the interviewer. Secondly, we have categorized the questions by individual contributor and manager. And thirdly, we have integrated situational questions. So I will go into more detail on each of these components in the following slides. So for the interviews, we really want to help you see the candidate holistically and offer you tools to avoid just ticking boxes for each question, but rather know what to watch for throughout the interview and even before to get an idea of who's really in front of you. So specifically, we now offer several recommendations to interviewers so that they can assess the presence of a skill throughout the selection process with their candidates. So here are 2 examples for ability to synthesize and for decision-making quality. So for example, for ability to synthesize, the recommendation is the following. So look at the resume's summary elements. Does the person present each stage of their career clearly and succinctly, or do they include too many details? Do they conclude each role with summary or relevant learnings? So what this really digs into is more other specific elements, such as the candidate's resume, where you can really see their ability to synthesize in action. And similarly for decision-making quality, the recommendation is look closely at the topics the person chooses during the interview. Are they relevant to the position, to the role, and to what you are looking for as a recruiter? So this really digs deeper into the information you can gather from the actual interview itself based on the decision that the candidate makes throughout the interview process. So sometimes it can be difficult to understand whether a question is specific enough or even difficult enough, depending on the position that needs to be filled. So to help with this and to help you quickly target the right question according to the level of the position to be filled, we've created questions intended either for an individual contributor or for a manager. So here's an example of a Courage to Act interview question targeted towards an individual contributor versus a manager. So the individual contributor question asks, tell me about a situation in which you had to assert your leadership with a peer. Tell me about a situation where you would have liked to defend one of your decisions more vigorously. Whereas the manager question asks, provide an example of a situation where you had to impose limits and be firm with an employee. So as you can see, there is a difference in how the question is oriented to the specific level, either being an individual contributor or a manager. So this really helps you easily target which questions to use in your interview guide, depending on this specific role. So we're also very proud of our new situational questions. So for example, now to measure skills like planning, we have questions like the management committee asks you to roll out a new product or service. How do you plan the process? So we already had behavioral questions like the column on the right, but we've now added situational questions. So we therefore now have two completely different ways of measuring the same skill. So in the case of decision-making quality, on the one hand, the situational questions, we invite our candidates to describe their hypothetical behaviors in a situation. So behaviors that they're likely to encounter once they're in their position. So an example of this is you've just been hired, a good client confides in you that he doesn't like the way your colleague interacts with him, but asks you not to tell anyone. What do you do? So it's hypothetical and it's more future oriented. Whereas on the other hand, the behavioral questions, the candidate's invited to share their past experience in connection to the competency being assessed. So for example, tell me about a decision you are proud to have made. So Patricia, I'd like to ask you when you have used situational rather than behavioral questions.
So as I answer this question, if anyone in the audience has used situational behavior or situational questions before and they want to share when they've used situational versus behavioral, feel free to share in the chat and I'll also share my experience. So I find that situational questions are very helpful when that person has a little experience in that type of position. So for an example, let's say you have someone who's only been in an individual contributor role and they've never adopted a formal leadership position before, or might not necessarily have had opportunities to step into a leadership role, then it could be useful to ask some situational questions. And as Chloe said, situational are future oriented, but behavioral are, focused on the past. If someone doesn't have as much experience to draw from, then it might be more difficult to get a really meaningful response from them. So that's when it might be helpful to ask some situational questions rather than behavioral ones. And since I don't see anything in the chat, then Chloe can share with you some of the benefits of both of these.
Great, thank you, Patricia. So building on what Patricia has just shared with us, there really are advantages to both situational and behavioral questions, and they can really just be used in different instances. So for a situational question, it can be really useful when a candidate has little experience, as Patricia mentioned. So this allows us to measure reactions without giving an advantage to someone who might have more experience. A situational question is also useful when there are several candidates being assessed at the same time. So this really allows for their answers to be compared a bit more easily. And finally, situational questions do not put anyone at a disadvantage, as some candidates might be less familiar with behavioral questions, which can be better answered by someone who is better prepared for these types of questions. And as for behavioral questions, they can be really useful when a candidate does have past experience with this type of role, because this allows them to highlight their relevant experience in relation to each of the competencies being assessed. And in fact, past behaviors are recognized as one of the best predictors of job performance. And it can also be very, it's very difficult to lie in these types of interview questions because the information can really be verified by references as it is based on past experiences. So overall, to summarize these three optimizations and their added value, the situational questions can be really interesting to assess the level of mastery or potential of an individual on different skills, and that helps you plan the development of each candidate as well. The optimizations really do improve efficiency, as the classifications of questions for individual contributors and managers allows you to quickly target the questions to include in your interview guide. And finally, we have a more precise and holistic assessment here, where the interviewer notes really allow you to target what to pay attention to during the entire interview beyond the answers that are provided related to each question.
Okay, so let's talk about the last optimization that we included. And so if you've already done the walkthrough for the online referential, then myself or one of my colleagues would have already alerted you that this optimization or update was coming. And so if you've explored the online referential, you would have noticed our development avenues are really geared towards people who have a gap. So they're weak on those specific competencies, and how can we get them to a level of functional competence? But really what we wanted to do with this optimization really align with our vision of supporting the growth and development of individuals is now we've provided 48 development avenues, which are based on our competencies for people who are already strong on those competencies. And so really the intention behind that, if you have a strength in that competency, how can you push it even further to maximize your contribution value to the organization? And so, this really aligns nicely as well, because we always encourage, our clients in a development plan, not just to focus on the weaknesses, but really focusing on leveraging that individual's strengths. And so these development avenues will give you some ideas and insight in terms of how you can support the development of your employees with respect to their strengths. And so, what I'll walk through with you is really, first, what's the vision? What does this development avenue look like? And so really what we've done here in terms of, propelling your strengths is there's different, tracks, and you can see on the slide, it says track 1, track 2, and track 3. So these are really kind of different areas or ways or methods in which that person can leverage their strengths. So in track 1, we might say, they can coach someone else. So how can they coach someone else on a talent where they're strong? So if you think of a manager who's really effective at developing and mobilizing her team, are there other individuals in the organization that she can coach to develop, to help them develop? And through that, she can probably learn to, further solidify her skill. So it helps her to develop her skill, as well as also maximizing her contribution value to others in the organization. If we look at the second track, there's ideas for new challenges that person can take on. So maybe there are different situations or opportunities where they haven't yet leveraged that strength. And if they were to leverage that strength in that new challenge or opportunity, it could enable them to propel that strength even further and strengthen their impact. And then the third track is really encouraging them to, partner in a co-development context with their peers who also share that strength. And then they can benefit from the collective wisdom of the group to really further refine and develop with respect to that particular strength. And so, if we look at the slide, we share some of the benefits or advantages to really focusing on strengths. And really here we say it allows you to use your strengths in situations that you haven't previously thought of. It also enables you to maximize your contribution value and performance at work. And also there's a lot of research that demonstrates that people that use their strengths, that consciously leverage them, they find that a lot more energizing than focusing on their weaknesses. And so it really contributes to greater well-being and happiness among employees. So we'll also find in the next slide, there's a section called Perfecting Your Skills. And so this is based on the Kolb model that really integrates different learning styles. So knowing that people have, different ways in which they best learn or they learn optimally, this section really characterizes, 3 different sections that capitalize on those different learning styles, that provide individuals with recommendation or ideas on how they can leverage their strength in a way that capitalizes on their preferred learning style. And so these 3 categories are first, experimentation. So people who like to learn through doing, that are more action oriented. This will provide insights in terms of how they can, experiment with new actions, try different things. The second section is really for people who prefer to be very thoughtful and more reflective before they act. So it gives them some really, pivotal reflection questions to really push and challenge their thinking and deepen their insight and knowledge with respect to that competency. And then the third section, which we describe on the next slide, is called Broadening Your Knowledge. And so this is really geared towards, and if we go to the next slide, this is really geared towards people who prefer to learn by, reading, for example, or more formal educational methods. And so if you remember from our previous development avenues, we really drew mostly on readings as well as courses and training. And so here we've really expanded that to account for the fact that there's a lot of rich knowledge and expertise in podcasts and videos like TED Talks, as well as shorter articles. So rather than reading, a book, a short punchy HBR article, for example, or pulling in scientific articles on that topic, and as well as books. And so really when, some of my colleagues selected the content for these development avenues, they really were careful to make sure that it was relevant to how we define that competency, to really consider the author's credibility. So are they considered to be an expert on this topic? And also looking for more recent evidence, or really limiting our resources to the last 10 years to make sure that we're capitalizing on more recent knowledge and that it's up to date to reflect our clients' reality. Okay, so let's speak to the added value of these optimizations for our development avenue. And so first, again, we're focusing on strengths. So really getting people to maximize their contribution value and leverage those strengths more intentionally. And with perfecting, skills, it really caters to a diversity of learning styles. And it also can be used to push someone outside of their preferred learning style. So if you have someone who's really action-oriented, that perhaps could take some time to be more reflective, to increase self-awareness, then they can benefit from the section on reflection. And also evidence-based, we made sure there's so many resources out there, and often, when I support candidates or leaders in their growth, they're often looking for direction on what to do, and there's so many resources for them to go through. But here we've provided them with catered resources. So providing them with the resources that are evidence-based so they don't have to do that work on their own, so they're getting the right tools. Okay.
So at this point, we're going to launch a polling question. So you can see on the screen the polling question, and you should also have a pop-up in front of you, which will allow you to vote on which optimization you think you'll really use the most in your day-to-day. So that should be launched now, and you can begin your voting. So I'll just give everyone a few minutes here.
So, and it looks like there isn't necessarily consensus in that everyone has, except for 2 individuals, have chosen a different category, which I think probably just reflects, the different realities of your organizations, as well as maybe the different nuances, in your roles. And so I think what that tells us is that we've really catered to, a broad variety of needs here and captured a lot of the needs of our clients. So it's really reassuring to see that you also find that there's a lot of utility in these different optimizations that we provided.
Wonderful. So up next, we're going to take a brief look at a few recommendations from our experts.
Okay, so as you continue to explore these optimizations, we have a few recommendations that my colleagues put together. And so first, when we think about the first optimization with the competency model, we really encourage you to take ownership of that. So we adapted the language and adapted the competencies, based on what we were seeing in the scientific literature and also what we were hearing from our clients, but make sure that those, new behavioral anchors reflect your business reality, and really think about, how might this look like within my reality, and how is it aligned with our context? With respect to the interview guides and the updates, we really encourage you to look through those so that you can complement your current guides as well as your future guides. And really, like Chloe said, looking at some of the notes and the recommendations we provided in terms of what else can you look for in an interview or pay attention to aside from that candidate specific response. Also encourage you to look at the questions that we tailored for different job levels, whether the individual contributor question, or the manager level question. And I think also something we didn't talk about, asking someone who's applied for a leadership position that hasn't had that role before might feel that, intimidated, might feel like they're lacking that experience. And so asking those tailored questions helps to create that level of comfort within the candidate, because they feel like they have relevant experience that they can speak to showcase their strengths. And then also considering and thinking about, when might I use situational questions, and what might be the added value of using a situational question over a behavioral one. And then finally, and I'm sure that you've heard us say this before, as you look through the new development avenues, we always encourage in creating development plans to focus on 2 talents and 1 area of development. And I think this is the case both when we're developing people already in the organization, and also when we're creating a development plan for new candidates. It's a lot more energizing and builds confidence to focus on our strengths than to purely focus on our areas for development. So some next steps. So we are always looking to add additional resources to meet the evolving needs of our clients. So some next steps that we're taking and changes that you can expect to see in the future are: first, our talent dictionary; second, a template for an individual development plan. We'll also be providing some recommended competency profiles for different roles or contexts, so you don't need to necessarily complete them from scratch, and that will integrate our expertise and the profiles that we've used in the past across clients and across industries. And then also some insight into derailers. So derailers are clusters of behaviors that emerge for someone when they're under stress that can negatively impact their performance or hold them back. So we'll be providing some insight and resources into that. Okay, so at this point, Chloe and I are just going to take some time to look through the Q&A to see what questions individuals have posed during the presentation, so we can make sure that we address those for you. If you have one that's top of mind that you haven't put in the Q&A, you can feel free to do that now. And if not, we can make sure to address them afterwards. Okay, I see a question in the Q&A. Do you want to go ahead and read it, Chloe?
Sure, yeah. So this question asks, why would you recommend working on 2 talents and only 1 development area?
So the reason for that, and I would say, if there's a lot of research to show that people who focus on their strengths are a lot more energized at work, and as well, it leads to better performance. And so oftentimes with weaknesses, we're not going to take someone who, is very low to all of a sudden become a strength or an area of proficiency. And so really, when we look at the scientific literature, we look at development areas, and often we're trying to get that to an area of functional competence. Whereas with the strengths, if someone has, a strength or a talent, we want to think about how can we maximize their contribution value. Maybe this individual has a strength that, has not necessarily been as recognized by them. It's not being leveraged in all the right circumstances. And because it comes more naturally to them, there are different ways we can probably get a lot more value from it and a lot more impact and increase performance and employee well-being if we learn to capitalize on that. And I would also say, if you think about, someone that you're bringing into an organization, if you want to leverage the insights from the interview or assessment process to create a development plan, it's a lot more encouraging when you approach that new employee by focusing on their strengths and how to leverage those, than to highlight all the areas they need to get better at in order to do the job well.
Great, thank you, Patricia. And I see one more here in the Q&A. So if I want to assess someone who's never had management experience, am I better off asking a manager question or some other type of question?
So I would say this is a big part of why we included the situational questions. So if that person has never had, leadership experience, then that could be an opportunity to ask a situational question to get some insight into how they are likely to respond. And at the same time, we also included, for some of the competencies, questions that you can ask if they've never had leadership experience before. So those are some different ways at which you can get insight into how they're likely to behave or show up without them necessarily having had that management experience before.
That's great. Thank you, Patricia. So I'll just again open the floor to any more questions that you can put in the Q&A or in the chat. And otherwise, I think we'll end the webinar at that. And of course, if you have any follow-up questions, so we have our contact information on the next page here, as well as at the bottom, info@Humance is where your questions can be directed, and we will get back to you on those.
Okay, thank you everyone for attending. Chloe and I will stay on for a few more minutes. If you have any questions and want to put them in the chat, we'll be here for you. Otherwise, thank you so much for coming.